The night was deceptively calm over the Atlantic Ocean. June 1st, 2009, was supposed to be just another routine transatlantic flight, an ordinary journey across the skies, where highly trained pilots and advanced technology worked in perfect harmony. Air France Flight 447, a modern Airbus A330-203, had taken off from Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport at 7:29 p.m. local time, bound for Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. On board were 216 passengers and 12 crew members, a diverse group of travelers, business executives, families, tourists, each with their own stories, their own expectations of reaching France safely by morning. For the first 3 hours of the flight, everything proceeded as planned. The aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet, high above the Atlantic, far from the worries of the world below. The passengers were settling in for the long haul, some watching in-flight entertainment, others closing their eyes in anticipation of a few hours of sleep before touching down in Europe. In the cockpit, Captain Marc Dubois, a seasoned pilot, with over 11,000 flight hours, was preparing for a scheduled rest break, leaving the controls in the capable hands of First Officer David Robert and his fellow co-pilot, Pierre-Cédric Bonin. The A330, a marvel of engineering, was designed to handle the complexities of long-haul travel with ease. Its automated systems capable of managing much of the flight with minimal manual intervention. But beneath the placid exterior of the night sky, an unseen danger was brewing. The aircraft was approaching a vast, volatile stretch of weather known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, a treacherous belt of thunderstorms and turbulence that sprawls across the equator, where warm, moist air from both hemispheres collides to create towering clouds, unpredictable wind currents, and intense lightning storms. Pilots were no strangers to the ITCZ. It was a common feature of transatlantic routes, something that modern radar and experience helped them navigate safely. But on this night, conditions were particularly hostile. A complex system of storm cells lay directly in their flight path, unseen by the passengers, but quietly recorded by the aircraft's onboard weather radar. At 1:35 a.m. UTC, Flight 447 entered this unstable region, where towering cumulonimbus clouds, stretching over 50,000 feet into the sky, concealed violent updrafts and ice-filled turbulence. The aircraft, though built to withstand significant weather disturbances, was about to face a situation for which neither its systems nor its crew were fully prepared. The thunderstorms, vast and electrically charged, stretched for miles, and the pilots had few options to avoid them. The only way through was forward, trusting in their aircraft and training to carry them safely beyond the storm. For now, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The cockpit was calm, the autopilot maintaining altitude and speed with precision. Yet, unbeknownst to the pilots, a fatal sequence of events was about to unfold, set in motion by a force both simple and devastating. Ice. At 1:51 a.m. UTC, Flight 447 crossed deeper into the storm system, where temperatures plummeted to well below freezing. The aircraft's sensors, including its crucial pitot tubes, small, delicate instruments on the fuselage designed to measure airspeed, were exposed to the full force of nature. Normally, these sensors were heated to prevent ice formation, but the extreme cold and rapid accumulation of ice crystals overwhelmed them. Within moments, the tubes began to freeze over, and with their failure, the aircraft's flight computers were plunged into confusion. At precisely 2:10 a.m. UTC, the first sign of trouble arrived. The autopilot, which had been steadily guiding the aircraft, suddenly disengaged, signaling that the flight computers could no longer determine a reliable airspeed. The aircraft, now under manual control, subtly lurched, momentarily uncertain in its trajectory. In the cockpit, the pilots were instantly alerted to the anomaly. Warnings flashed on their screens, indicating that the airspeed readings had become unreliable, sending a cascade of errors throughout the system. Without accurate airspeed, the automation could no longer maintain control. Though the turbulence was intensifying, the aircraft itself remained intact, its engines still producing power, its wings still cutting through the dense night air. But the loss of airspeed data created a new and immediate problem. The pilots had no way of knowing whether they were flying too fast or too slow. This was a critical moment, a juncture where training, experience, and instinct would dictate the fate of Flight 447. In the seconds that followed, a crucial mistake was made. First Officer Bonin, the youngest and least experienced of the three pilots, instinctively pulled back on the control stick, attempting to gain altitude. In most situations, this reaction might have seemed logical. If turbulence was shaking the aircraft, gaining altitude could offer a sense of control. But in the unforgiving reality of high-altitude flight, pulling up without sufficient airspeed was a catastrophic decision. The aircraft, now climbing rapidly without the necessary thrust, began to lose its delicate balance in the thin atmosphere. At 2:11 a.m. UTC, the stall warning blared in the cockpit, a shrill and unmistakable alarm designed to indicate that the aircraft was no longer generating enough lift to sustain flight. The A330 had entered the beginnings of an aerodynamic stall, a deadly condition where the wings, instead of slicing through the air, were now losing their grip, causing the aircraft to sink. Yet, in the disorienting chaos of the cockpit, where multiple alarms sounded and the night sky outside revealed nothing but darkness, the full gravity of the situation was not immediately understood. Had the aircraft been at a lower altitude, there might have been room for recovery, but at 35,000 feet, the margin for error was razor-thin. The aircraft, despite its sleek and powerful design, was now at the mercy of physics. As the storm raged around them, as lightning illuminated the thick clouds outside, Flight 447 was no longer flying. It was beginning to fall. But the fall would not be immediate. Over the next critical moments, the pilots would struggle to regain control, unaware that each incorrect input was worsening the situation. With each second, the aircraft was slipping further into a freefall, plummeting toward the Atlantic Ocean below. What had begun as a routine night flight was now transforming into one of the most harrowing disasters in modern aviation history, and yet down in the passenger cabin, where the world's most sophisticated warning systems had no voice, there was only silence. The passengers, still strapped into their seats, still expecting a safe arrival in Paris, had no way of knowing that their fate had already been sealed. Above the Atlantic, in the heart of the storm, Flight 447 had lost its way. At 2:11 a.m. UTC, Air France Flight 447 was no longer flying, it was plummeting. From the outside, the aircraft appeared intact, its engines still functioning, its wings still outstretched against the wind. But inside the cockpit, confusion and fear were taking hold. The aircraft had entered an aerodynamic stall, a critical condition where the wings no longer generated lift, sending the plane into an uncontrolled descent. The pilots, disoriented by the sudden loss of airspeed data and the relentless turbulence, struggled to comprehend what was happening. The Airbus A330 was equipped with sophisticated automation designed to handle such emergencies, but in this moment, the loss of airspeed readings had crippled the flight computer's ability to assist. The aircraft was fully under manual control. Left to the hands of three pilots facing one of the deadliest scenarios in aviation. First Officer Pierre-Cedric Bonin, the pilot in control, was unknowingly worsening the situation. His instinct had been to pull back on the control stick, attempting to climb out of the turbulence, but at high altitudes, such a move could be catastrophic. Instead of leveling out, the aircraft's nose pitched upward sharply, robbing it of the remaining lift it needed to stay airborne. The stall warning blared again, a shrill, automated voice repeating the same message over and over. Stall! 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 It was a clear indication that the aircraft was no longer flying, but the pilots, caught in the chaos of multiple alarms and rapidly changing flight data, did not immediately react as they should have. Had they realized what was happening, The correct action would have been to push the nose downward, allowing the aircraft to regain speed and lift. But instead, Bonin continued to pull back on the stick, unaware that he was sealing the plane's fate. As the aircraft fell through the sky, it entered a near-vertical descent, dropping at an astonishing rate of 10,000 feet per minute. The engines, still running at nearly full power, were no longer propelling the aircraft forward. They were simply hurtling downward with it, providing no escape from the forces dragging it toward the ocean below. At 2:12 a.m. UTC, the aircraft had already lost over 5,000 feet of altitude, now plunging through 30,000 feet with no sign of recovery. The storm outside continued to rage, rain, and ice, battering the fuselage, lightning flashing in the clouds around them. The passengers, still unaware of the dire situation, were likely beginning to feel the effects of the rapid descent, sudden weightlessness, the eerie sensation of floating as gravity's grip loosened. Some may have noticed the cabin lights flickering, or the flight attendants gripping onto seats as they realized something was very, very wrong. Yet, inside the cockpit, confusion reigned. The aircraft's stall warning had briefly stopped, an automatic feature designed to cut off once the sensors detected that the aircraft was falling too steeply. But rather than take this as a sign that the stall was still in effect, the pilots may have assumed that the warning had been incorrect in the first place. This misunderstanding would cost them precious seconds, seconds that could have meant the difference between recovery and disaster. By 2:13 a.m. UTC, the aircraft had fallen through 25,000 feet. It was now far below its cruising altitude, descending at an angle so steep that the ground proximity warning system would soon begin to sound. The pilots, still trying to make sense of their instruments, were running out of time. The aircraft was not in a traditional dive. It was falling almost flat, with its nose slightly raised, its wings level but useless. The A330's tail-mounted flight data recorder, silently logging every movement and action, was capturing the terrifying details of the descent. The vertical speed indicator showed a relentless drop, the altimeter spinning downward at an alarming rate. Yet the most crucial warning remained unheard. The realization that the only way to escape the stall was to push the nose down and regain speed. At 2:14 a.m. UTC, Flight 447 fell below 20,000 feet. In just 4 minutes, it had lost nearly $15,000 feet of altitude, with no sign of recovery. The cold Atlantic waters were getting closer, though the passengers and crew had no way of knowing. From inside the aircraft, the outside world was invisible, just a black void beyond the windows, offering no sense of orientation or altitude. By this point, Captain Marc Dubois had returned to the cockpit, having been called back as the crisis escalated. But the situation had already spiraled out of control. With limited time to assess the problem, and with the aircraft now in freefall, his ability to take corrective action was severely limited. The confusion of instrument failures, the stress of multiple alarms, and the disorienting conditions outside had all combined into a perfect storm of chaos. At 2:15 a.m. UTC, the aircraft was now below 15,000 feet. The ocean, still unseen in the darkness, was just moments away. The stall warning, which had ceased for nearly a minute, suddenly resumed, indicating that the aircraft was still in a deep stall. In the final seconds, as the realization dawned that they were out of time, the pilots finally attempted to push the nose down, but it was too late. At 2:16 a.m. UTC, Air France Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. The impact was catastrophic. Striking the water at a near-horizontal angle, the aircraft shattered upon contact, breaking into thousands of pieces. The forces involved were so immense that there was no chance of survival. The 228 souls on board were lost instantly. The storm that had engulfed Flight 447 continued to rage above, the rolling waves of the Atlantic swallowing the wreckage. No distress call had been sent, no final message relayed to air traffic control. The aircraft had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind only silence. In the hours that followed, Air traffic controllers in Dakar and Paris attempted to reach Flight 447, unaware that it had already been lost. Relatives waiting in France were left in agonizing uncertainty as the minutes turned into hours, then into days. Search and rescue efforts were launched, but in the vastness of the Atlantic, finding the wreckage seemed an impossible task. For nearly 2 years, the final moments of Flight 447 remained a mystery. It was only in 2011 that the wreckage was finally discovered on the ocean floor over 13,000 feet below the surface. The flight data recorders, remarkably intact, would eventually reveal the truth, a story of ice, confusion, and a fatal misunderstanding of aerodynamics. The crash of Flight 447 was one of the deadliest in aviation history, a stark reminder of the delicate balance between human skill and automated systems. And though the tragedy claimed 228 lives, it also led to critical changes in pilot training, ensuring that future generations of aviators would be better equipped to recognize and recover from aerodynamic stalls. But on that fateful night, over the darkest depths of the Atlantic, there were no second chances. Flight 447 had descended into oblivion, taking with it the dreams, the stories, and the lives of those who had once soared above the clouds, believing they were safe. In the hours following the disappearance of Flight 447, confusion and uncertainty spread through the corridors of air traffic control centers across 3 continents. Scheduled to land at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris at 11:10 a.m. local time, the aircraft had simply failed to appear. There had been no distress call, no emergency squawk on the radar, no indication of trouble beyond a simple loss of communication. First, the absence of radio contact was not considered alarming. Transatlantic flights occasionally experienced communication blackouts, particularly over remote areas of the ocean where radio coverage was weaker. But as the minutes stretched into hours, a growing sense of unease settled over those monitoring the flight. By 9 a.m. UTC, the scheduled arrival time had long passed. Controllers at the airport in Paris were frantically attempting to reach the aircraft. Calls to the flight's assigned radio frequencies went unanswered. Coordination began between French, Brazilian, and Senegalese air traffic controllers, each hoping that another had received some final message from the crew. But there was nothing. Flight 447 had simply vanished into the vast expanse of the Atlantic. By midday on June 1, 2009, Air France publicly acknowledged that they had lost contact with Flight 447. The airline could offer no explanation, only that an investigation was underway. Families of the 228 passengers and crew waiting in Paris were left in agonizing limbo. The loved ones of those on board arrived at the airport, expecting joyful reunions. Instead, they were met with silence, confusion, and mounting fear. It was not until later that evening that the first official assumption was made: Flight 447 had been lost. The search for answers was no longer about locating a missing aircraft. It was now about finding wreckage. Within hours, a multinational search operation was launched. The Brazilian Air Force dispatched reconnaissance aircraft to scan the ocean, focusing on the last known coordinates of the flight, a vast area of the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 600 miles off the coast of Brazil. France sent naval vessels to assist, and additional aircraft from Spain and the United States joined in. The scale of the effort was immense, spanning thousands of square miles over deep, turbulent waters. On June 2nd, just over 24 hours after the aircraft had disappeared, the first heartbreaking discovery was made. A Brazilian Air Force reconnaissance plane spotted debris floating on the surface of the ocean, white fuselage fragments, seat cushions, and scattered wreckage. Soon after, a life vest and parts of the aircraft's galley were recovered. It was now undeniable: Flight 447 had crashed into the Atlantic. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the aviation industry and the families of those on board. Yet, while the discovery of floating debris confirmed the tragedy, it offered no insight into why the aircraft had gone down. There were no survivors, and the wreckage was widely dispersed across the surface, giving no clear indication of the point of impact. By June 6th, Brazilian recovery teams had retrieved the first bodies. Autopsies later revealed that many of the victims had sustained blunt force trauma, consistent with a high-speed impact with water. These findings suggested that the aircraft had crashed at high velocity, ruling out a controlled ditching attempt. The absence of fire damage confirmed that there had been no explosion, but with no cockpit voice recorder and no flight data recorder, investigators were left with little information. The debris on the surface could tell them only so much. The true answers lay somewhere deep beneath the waves. Unlike previous ocean crashes where debris was quickly recovered, the wreckage of Flight 447 presented a unique challenge. The aircraft had plunged into one of the most remote and inaccessible regions of the ocean, where the seabed lay nearly 13,000 feet below the surface. The underwater terrain was treacherous, jagged mountains, deep trenches, and unpredictable. Currents made locating the wreckage almost impossible. The search entered a critical phase. French authorities enlisted the help of international deep-sea exploration teams, deploying advanced sonar equipment and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, to scan the ocean floor. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Despite extensive searching, the black boxes, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder remained elusive. Without them, the investigation remained stuck in speculation. Several theories emerged. Some experts believed that extreme turbulence had torn the aircraft apart mid-air. Others suspected a catastrophic mechanical failure, but without hard data, no definitive cause could be determined. By August 2009, the first phase of the underwater search had ended in failure. The wreckage of Flight 447 remained hidden, and with it, the final moments of the doomed flight. For the families, the lack of closure was agonizing. They knew their loved ones were gone, but they did not know why. Determined not to let the mystery remain unsolved, the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, launched additional search phases over the next 2 years. Advanced deep-sea mapping technology was employed, using robotic submarines capable of scanning vast areas of the ocean floor. Finally, on April 3, 2011, nearly 2 years after the crash, a breakthrough came. A robotic submersible, scanning a previously unexplored section of the ocean, detected large pieces of debris. The images transmitted back to the surface were haunting. Sections of the fuselage, parts of the wing, and most crucially, the aircraft's tail section, still marked with the Air France logo. Within days, search teams confirmed the most significant discovery, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, still encased in their protective shells, buried in the seabed. Miraculously, they were intact. The recovery of these black boxes marked a turning point. For the first time, investigators had a way to piece together the final moments of Flight 447, to understand exactly what had gone wrong in the cockpit during those fateful minutes. When the data was analyzed, the truth was more devastating than anyone had imagined. The aircraft had not suffered a structural failure. It had not been brought down by lightning, nor had it fallen apart mid-air. Instead, the crash was the result of a fatal misunderstanding. Human error, compounded by technology in the midst of a storm. The black box recordings revealed the precise sequence of events that had led to disaster. The temporary icing of the pitot tubes had led to the autopilot disengaging. This moment of confusion had triggered a series of incorrect pilot responses, culminating in the aircraft entering an aerodynamic stall. The pilots had failed to recognize the stall and had spent nearly 4 minutes pulling back on the controls instead of pushing forward to regain speed. Had they taken the correct action, lowering the nose to recover from the stall, the aircraft could have been saved. But in the darkness, disoriented, with alarms blaring and a loss of situational awareness, they had unknowingly sealed their fate. The revelations from the investigation sent shockwaves through the aviation community. How could such an advanced aircraft, flown by experienced pilots, succumb to such a preventable error? The tragedy forced the aviation industry to re-examine pilot training, leading to fundamental changes in how pilots are taught to recognize and recover from stalls. Airbus and Boeing revised their training procedures, emphasizing the importance of manual flying skills and ensuring that pilots understood how to respond in situations where automated systems failed. Airlines worldwide introduced new programs focused on high-altitude stall recovery, ensuring that a similar mistake would never happen again. For the families of the victims, these changes were small consolations in the face of immeasurable loss. No regulation or policy could bring back their loved ones. But their tragedy had led to a safer future for millions of passengers, ensuring that the lessons learned from Flight 447 would not be forgotten. In the deep, dark waters of the Atlantic, the remains of Flight 447 still rest, a silent memorial to a flight that never reached its destination. A reminder of the fragile balance between human skill and machine, and of the night when that balance was tragically lost. In the days, weeks, and years following the crash of Air France Flight 447, the world was left to grapple with the stark realities of modern aviation, how a state-of-the-art aircraft, flying under normal conditions, could vanish without warning, taking 228 lives with it. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the airline industry, forcing difficult questions about automation, pilot training, and the limits of human response in high-stress environments. For the families of the victims, the search for answers was not just an academic exercise, it was deeply personal. Many had spent years clinging to uncertainty, waiting for news that might explain the senseless loss of their loved ones. When the final investigative report was released in 2012, confirming that the crash was the result of human error compounded by technological failures, it brought a painful mix of closure and frustration. The findings revealed that the pilots had not been adequately trained to handle high-altitude stalls, a scenario that, while rare, could quickly become fatal if misunderstood. The emphasis on automation in modern cockpits had inadvertently created a generation of pilots who, when faced with a sudden manual emergency, were not prepared to take decisive action. The reliance on technology had created a dangerous paradox. While automation made flying safer under normal conditions, it had also eroded pilots' ability to handle situations when those systems failed. For Air France, the fallout was severe. The airline faced lawsuits from families, regulatory scrutiny, and a public relations crisis that would take years to recover from. Airbus, the manufacturer of the A330, also came under fire for the design of the pitot tubes, which had frozen over during the storm, triggering the cascade of failures that led to the crash. While the pitot tubes were later replaced with improved models, the true issue was not a mechanical failure but a breakdown in communication between man and machine. The loss of Flight 447 became a turning point for the airline industry. Investigators and experts pushed for significant changes in pilot training, recognizing that automation had created a dangerous gap in pilot skills. New training programs were introduced worldwide, focusing on manual flying skills and high-altitude stall recovery. Simulators were modified to replicate the exact conditions faced by Flight 447, allowing pilots to experience firsthand the deadly consequences of incorrect stall responses. One of the most crucial lessons from the disaster was the importance of situational awareness. The pilots of Flight 447 had been disoriented by the loss of airspeed data and the chaos of multiple alarms. Instead of trusting basic aerodynamics, lowering the nose to regain speed, they had become fixated on conflicting instrument readings. In response, airlines revised their cockpit procedures, emphasizing teamwork and communication between pilots in moments of crisis. The concept of startle effect, the psychological phenomenon where sudden, unexpected events cause a freeze in decision-making, became a focal point in pilot education. The goal was to ensure that pilots would not be overwhelmed by surprise, but instead respond with trained reflexes that could save lives. While the aviation industry moved forward with technical reforms, the emotional toll of Flight 447 remained deep and permanent. The families of the victims fought for years for recognition, demanding that airlines and regulators take responsibility for the failures that led to the crash. Memorials were built in France and Brazil, commemorating those who perished in the disaster. Many families expressed frustration with the slow pace of the investigation. For nearly 2 years, they had been left in limbo, not knowing whether the wreckage would ever be found, whether they would ever know what had happened to their loved ones. The secrecy and bureaucracy surrounding the search efforts only deepened their grief, fueling calls for greater transparency in aviation accident investigations. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Flight 447 was the sheer normalcy of the flight before it went wrong. Passengers had boarded the aircraft with no reason to suspect that it would be anything other than a routine journey across the Atlantic. Some had texted loved ones before departure, sending messages that would later be their last words. Others had settled into their seats for a long night of travel, unaware that they would never wake up to see another sunrise. For the families, the knowledge that their loved ones had experienced a long, terrifying descent before impact was almost unbearable. Though the final report suggested that most passengers had likely been unconscious in the final seconds, the thought of their suffering lingered. The tragedy was not just the loss of life, but the knowledge that it could have been prevented. In the years since the crash, the aviation industry has made significant changes to ensure that a disaster like Flight 447 never happens again. Automated systems have been redesigned to prevent similar failures, and pilot training has been overhauled to prioritize hands-on flying skills alongside technical knowledge. The lessons learned from the tragedy have saved lives, ensuring that future pilots will be better equipped to handle emergencies in the air. Yet, despite all the changes, the memory of Flight 447 remains a somber reminder of aviation's delicate balance between technology and human judgment. The skies are safer today because of the hard lessons learned from that night, but the cost of those lessons was immeasurable. Deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the wreckage of Flight 447 still rests, a silent monument to the fragility of human life and the enduring mystery of flight. For those who lost loved ones, the ocean is not just a body of water. It is a grave, a place where dreams were lost in the dark sky, where a routine flight became a tragedy that shook the world. But above that same ocean, aircraft continue to cross the skies every day, carrying new stories, new lives, and new hopes. And though Flight 447 never reached its destination, its legacy lives on in the changes it inspired, a promise that such a tragedy will never be allowed to happen again. The end.